Sometimes, the loneliest souls recognize each other across impossible distances. In the small frontier town of Cedar Bluff, 5-year-old Eli knew that feeling every time he looked at the giant brown horse standing alone in the old corral. The massive horse had one strict rule that everyone feared. Don't touch it. The whole town knew this rule by heart. Nobody dared question why. The horse was left behind 3 years ago when a wealthy land baron vanished without explanation. Since then, it stood there like a silent guardian of secrets. Eli's father breaks wild horses for a living, but this towering giant remained forbidden. The townspeople whispered warnings and looked away whenever they passed. Little Eli watched that horse every single day, feeling something stir deep in his chest. When drought threatened their farm and his father grew distant with worry, Eli's world felt smaller. What happens when a curious child breaks the one rule that keeps the town safe? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the mesa when Samuel Thorne pulled on his worn leather gloves, the same pair his own father had given him 20 years before. The creased brown hide bore the marks of countless mornings, just like this one breaking. Wild mustangs in the dusty corral behind their small adobe house on the outskirts of Cedar Bluff. These gloves had seen him through his wedding day, through the birth of his son, and through the dark months after his wife Maria passed, bringing their second child into a world that wouldn't let the baby stay. "Eli, come help your pa," Samuel called, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to be both father and mother to a boy who asked too many questions about things better left alone. 5-year-old Eli scrambled from the wooden porch, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each eager step. The boy had his mother's dark eyes and quick smile, but Samuel's stubborn streak ran through him like a vein of iron ore. At 5, Eli could already slip a halter on a gentle mare and knew which end of a horse would bite and which would kick. He had gentle hands for such a small thing, hands that horses seemed to trust instinctively. "Is today the day we work with thunder?" Eli asked, referring to the black stallion they'd brought in from the wild country 3 days prior. The horse still snorted and pawed whenever anyone approached, but Eli had been watching it with the patient intensity that worried his father. "Not yet, son. Thunder needs more time to settle." Samuel lifted his boy onto the corral fence, where Eli could watch safely while still feeling useful. "Today we work with the bay mare. She's ready to learn." Cedar Bluff stretched before them in the morning light. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that ran straight as a rifle shot from the train depot to the old mission church. The town had grown up around the railway, serving the ranchers and miners who worked the harsh country that stretched endlessly in all directions. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a man's word meant everything, and where certain topics were never discussed in polite company. Mrs. Henderson's general store occupied the town's heart. Its false front, painted white, though the desert sun had faded it to the color of old bones. Sheriff Martinez kept his office 3 doors down, and Doc Williams maintained his practice in the building that also served as the unofficial town meeting hall. These were the people who shaped Eli's small world, along with the handful of other families who'd chosen to make their lives in this unforgiving country. The drought had been building for months now, each day bringing less hope and more worry. The creek that ran behind their property had dwindled to a trickle, forcing Samuel to haul water from the town well for their animals. The grass had turned brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like old paper. Samuel watched the sky each morning for signs of rain clouds, but the heavens remained stubbornly clear, a hard blue dome that seemed to mock their prayers. "Pa, why doesn't anyone talk about the big horse?" Ale asked, his legs swinging against the fence posts. From where they sat, The old corral was visible at the town's eastern edge, a ramshackle structure that housed the most magnificent and mysterious animal either of them had ever seen. Samuel's hand stilled on the Mara's neck. This was the question he'd been dreading, the one that came up more frequently as Eli grew older and more observant. The giant brown horse stood in that corral like a monument to something the town wanted desperately to forget. "Some things are better left alone, son. That horse belongs to Mr. Blackwood, and when he comes back, he'll take it with him." But even as Samuel spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow. Cornelius Blackwood had been gone for 3 years now, vanishing on a night when storm clouds had gathered but no rain had fallen. He'd left behind debts at the general store, a half-finished house on the hill overlooking town, and that massive horse that no one dared approach. Eli had been too young to remember Blackwood clearly, but Samuel recalled him well, a tall man with expensive clothes and nervous eyes who'd arrived in Cedar Bluff with grand plans and a horse trailer pulled by 6 oxen. Blackwood had spoken of mining opportunities and land development, throwing money around like a man who had plenty to spare. Then one morning, he was simply gone, leaving behind only questions and that enormous animal that seemed to watch everything, with an intelligence that made grown men uncomfortable. "But Pa, Mr. Blackwood's been gone a really long time. Doesn't the horse get lonely?" Samuel lifted his son down from the fence and guided him toward the house. "Horses don't get lonely the same way people do, Eli. Now come on, your breakfast is getting cold." Their home was small but well built, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool even when the desert sun blazed overhead. Maria had decorated it with the bright colors she'd loved, deep blues and warm yellows that reminded her of the mountains where she'd grown up. Samuel had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, unable to bear changing anything that still carried her touch. Eli ate his cornbread and beans while chattering about the horses, about wanting to help more with the training, about a dozen other topics that flitted through his quick mind like hummingbirds. Samuel listened with half his attention while the other half worried about money, about water, about the strange looks some of the townspeople had been giving his son lately. After breakfast, they walked into town for supplies. The main street baked under the climbing sun, and the few people who were out moved slowly, conserving their energy for the long day ahead. Mrs. Henderson waved from her store window, and Doc Williams tipped his hat as he headed toward the Martinez place where their youngest had been running a fever. Sheriff Martinez emerged from his office as they passed, a weathered man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Cedar Bluff for nearly 20 years. He had kind eyes and a patient manner that made him popular with the townspeople, but Samuel noticed the way his gaze lingered on Eli. "Morning, Samuel. How's the boy doing?" "Growing too fast," Samuel replied, his hand resting protectively on Eli's shoulder. "Growing too curious about things he shouldn't." Martinez nodded slowly. "Boys that age, they notice everything. Maybe it's time someone explained things properly." Samuel felt his jaw tighten. There's nothing to explain. Just old fears and older superstitions. Maybe so. But fears have a way of growing when they're not talked about. The sheriff's eyes moved to Eli, who was studying a lizard sunning itself on the wooden sidewalk. "That's a fine boy you've got there, Samuel. Be a shame if old fears started affecting how folks treat him." The warning was gentle but clear. Samuel had heard the whispers starting about how Eli spent too much time staring toward the old corral, about how the boy had his mother's foreign look, about how some children seemed drawn to things that weren't natural. In a small town, whispers had a way of becoming truth if they weren't stopped early. They completed their business quickly and headed home. But as they passed the old corral, Eli stopped walking. The giant brown horse stood in the center of the enclosure, its massive head turned toward the road as if it had been waiting for them to pass. The animal had to be 18 hands high, with a coat the color of rich earth and a mane that fell like a waterfall down its powerful neck. "Pa, look how beautiful it is," Eli whispered, his small hand gripping the fence rail. The horse took a step toward them, then another. Its dark eyes seemed to focus directly on the boy, and Samuel felt something cold move through his chest. For a moment that stretched too long, the animal and the child regarded each other across the dusty space, and Samuel could have sworn he saw recognition pass between them. "Eli, come away from there, now." But his son didn't move. The horse had come closer, close enough that its warm breath fogged the air near Eli's face. The massive animal lowered its head slightly, and Samuel saw his son's hand begin to rise toward the fence. "Eli!" Samuel's sharp command broke the spell. The boy jerked back as if waking from a dream, his eyes wide and confused. They walked home in silence, but Samuel could feel his son's questions building like storm clouds on the horizon. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Samuel sat on his porch and studied the stars, while trying to convince himself that what he'd witnessed was nothing more than a curious child and a lonely animal. But deep in his chest, in the place where a man keeps his worst fears, Samuel knew better. There had been something in that moment by the corral, something that reminded him of stories his own grandmother had whispered when he was Eli's age. Stories about horses that carried spirits, about animals that chose their own masters, about bonds that transcended the ordinary world. Stories he'd thought were just old superstitions until today. The wind picked up as the night deepened, carrying the scent of dust and dried grass across the desert. Somewhere in the distance, Samuel heard the sound of hoofbeats, though he knew no one would be riding at this hour. He listened until the sound faded, then went inside to check on his sleeping son. Eli lay curled beneath his blanket, one small hand pressed against the window that faced east toward the old corral. Even in sleep, the boy seemed to be reaching for something just beyond his grasp, and Samuel felt his heart squeeze with a fear he couldn't name. The storm came 3 weeks later, arriving with all the fury of nature's broken promises. Thunder rolled across the desert like cannon fire, and lightning split the night sky in jagged scars of white light. But no rain fell, only wind that howled through the gaps in buildings and sent tumbleweeds dancing down the main street like ghostly performers. Samuel woke to the sound of splintering wood. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his lantern, calling for Eli to stay inside while he went to check on their animals. The wind fought him every step to the corral, trying to tear the lantern from his grasp and fill his eyes with stinging sand. Their horses huddled against the far side of the enclosure, spooked by the storm, but safe. Samuel counted them twice, to be sure, then began his walk around the property to check for damage. That's when he saw it, the broken fence post at the eastern edge of their land, the rotting timber finally giving way to the wind's assault. The post marked the boundary between their property and the old corral where the giant brown horse lived. Now a gap yawned in the fence line, wide enough for a small person to slip through easily. Samuel cursed under his breath and made a mental note to repair it first thing in the morning. The last thing he needed was for Eli to discover a way to get closer to that animal. But morning brought its own troubles. The storm had damaged more than just fencing. Mrs. Henderson's store had lost half its roof. The church bell tower leaned at a dangerous angle, and the creek behind their house had gone completely dry. The whole town looked as if it had been shaken by an angry giant. Samuel spent the day helping with repairs, leaving Eli under Doc Williams' watchful eye while the men worked to shore up the most critical damage. It was late afternoon before he remembered the broken fence post, and later still before he made it home to discover his son was missing. "Eli," Samuel called, checking the house, the barn, the corral where their horses stood listlessly in the heat. "Eli, where are you, son?" A terrible certainty settled in his chest. Samuel ran toward the eastern fence line, his boots slipping in the loose sand. The gap in the fence looked even wider in daylight, and beyond it, the old corral shimmered in the heat like a mirage dot. He found Eli standing 3 feet from the giant brown horse, close enough to touch the animal's massive shoulder. The boy stood perfectly still, his small hand extended toward the horse's neck, while the enormous creature lowered its head until their foreheads almost touched. "Eli, don't move," Samuel whispered, afraid that any sudden sound might startle the horse into trampling his son. But Eli turned at his father's voice, his dark eyes bright with wonder. "Pa, he's not scary at all. He's just lonely like me." The horse lifted its head, studying Samuel with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. For a moment, the 3 of them formed a tableau frozen in the desert heat. Man, boy, and beast connected by invisible threads of fear and fascination. "Step away from the horse, Eli," slowly. His son obeyed, but reluctantly, his eyes never leaving the animal's face. Samuel grabbed Eli's hand and pulled him back through the gap in the fence, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Pa, why are you scared? He wouldn't hurt anybody. I could tell." "How could you tell such a thing?" Samuel demanded, kneeling to look his son in the eye. "Horses are dangerous, Eli. That one especially. You must never, ever go near it again. Do you understand me?" Eli nodded, but Samuel saw the confusion in his expression, the hurt that came from being scolded for something that had felt natural and right. They walked home in silence, Samuel already dreading what would happen when word of this incident reached the rest of the town. He didn't have to wait long. Mrs. Henderson appeared at their door before supper, her face white with shock, and her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "Samuel, I saw the boy with that creature. Dear Lord in heaven, I saw them touching each other like old friends." "Nothing happened, Mrs. Henderson. Eli was curious, that's all. He won't go near the horse again." But the older woman shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Samuel. That horse, there's something wrong with it. Something that ain't natural. It's just an animal that's been alone too long. Animals don't still for 3 years without moving from the same spot," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Animals don't watch people with eyes that remember things. That creature has been waiting for something, Samuel. I think it's been waiting for your boy." After she left, Samuel barred the door and checked the windows twice. He tried to eat supper, tried to make conversation with Eli about normal things, the weather, the horses they'd be training next week. Anything but giant brown animals and the way they seemed to recognize lonely children. That night, Eli's dreams were full of thunder and running hooves. He woke several times crying out, and each time Samuel went to comfort him, he found his son staring out the window toward the old corral. "I dreamed I was flying, Pa," Eli whispered during his 3rd awakening, "flying across the desert on the big horse. It wasn't scary. It was the most wonderful thing I ever felt." Samuel sat on the edge of his son's bed, smoothing the boy's dark hair. "It was just a dream, son. Just your mind mixing up the storm with what happened today. But it felt real. More real than anything." The next morning brought Sheriff Martinez and 3 other men to their door. Samuel recognized them all: Tom Bradley, who ran the livery stable; Frank Morrison, who'd come through town a few days before looking to buy horses; and old Pete Sanchez, who'd lived in Cedar Bluff longer than anyone else. "Samuel, we need to talk," Martinez said, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by official sternness. "About your boy and what happened yesterday." They gathered around Samuel's kitchen table while Eli played outside, unaware that his future was being decided by men who feared what they didn't understand. "The whole town's talking," Bradley said without preamble, "saying the boy has some kind of unnatural connection to that creature." "He's 5 years old," Samuel protested. "Children are curious about animals. There's nothing unnatural about it. There is when the animal's been standing motionless for 3 years and suddenly starts responding to a child's presence. Frank Morrison added, I've been around horses my whole life, Samuel. What I saw yesterday wasn't normal behavior for either species. Old Pete leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. My grandmother was full Lakota, he said quietly. She told stories about spirit horses, animals that carried the souls of warriors who died far from home. Said they could only find peace when they found the right person to carry them back to the spirit world. Superstitious nonsense, Samuel snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe so, Martinez said. But superstitious or not, people are scared. They're talking about taking matters into their own hands if something isn't done. What are you suggesting? Send the boy away for a while, Bradley urged. Just until we can figure out what to do about that horse. Maybe ship it to another territory. Find someone willing to take it off our hands. Samuel looked out the window where Eli was building something with sticks and stones, his small face serious with concentration. The idea of sending his son away made his chest tight with panic, but the alternative, facing down an entire town's fear, seemed even worse. I'll think about it, he said finally. After the men left, Samuel walked to the broken fence post and stared across the gap at the old corral. The giant brown horse stood in exactly the same position as always, but now its head was turned toward Samuel's house, toward the window of Eli's room. As he watched, the animal's ears pricked forward, and Samuel could have sworn he heard his son's laughter carried on the desert wind. When he turned around, Eli was nowhere to be seen. Samuel found Eli in the old corral's tack room, a ramshackle shed attached to the main enclosure that no one had entered in the 3 years since Blackwood's disappearance. His son knelt in the dusty straw, carefully examining something that gleamed silver in the dim light filtering through the cracked wooden walls. Eli, what are you doing in here? Samuel's voice was sharp with fear and frustration. The boy looked up, his dark eyes bright with excitement. Pa, look what I found hidden under all this old straw. It's the most beautiful thing I ever saw. In Eli's small hands lay an ornate silver bridle, its metalwork more intricate than anything Samuel had ever seen. Strange symbols were etched into the silver pieces, spirals and angular designs that seemed to shift and dance in the changing light. The leather straps were supple despite their age, as if someone had been caring for them all this time. Put that down, son. It doesn't belong to us. But Pa, it was just lying here forgotten. And look, Eli traced one of the symbols with his finger. These pictures tell a story, but I can't understand what they mean. Samuel knelt beside his son and examined the bridle more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, unlike anything he'd seen in all his years working with horses. The silver seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the symbols did indeed appear to tell some kind of story running horses. Mountains, figures that might have been men or spirits. We'll take it to Doc Williams, Samuel decided. He knows about old things, about history. Maybe he can tell us what these markings mean. They wrapped the bridle in an old feed sack and walked into town, Eli chattering excitedly about his discovery, while Samuel fought the growing unease in his chest. Something about those symbols nagged at him, as if he'd seen them before in dreams he couldn't quite remember. Doc Williams' office occupied the ground floor of what had once been a grand hotel. Before the railroad changed its route and left Cedar Bluff high and dry, the doctor was a scholarly man in his 60s who'd come west for his health and stayed for reasons he never fully explained. His office doubled as the town's unofficial library, its walls lined with books on medicine, history, and subjects most frontier towns had never heard of. Remarkable, Doc Williams murmured, adjusting his spectacles as he examined the bridle. These symbols are definitely Native American in origin, but the combination is unusual. See this spiral here? That's a Lakota symbol for a spiritual journey. And this one represents a guardian spirit. What does it all mean together? Samuel asked. I'd need to research it more thoroughly, but it appears to tell the story of a warrior spirit bound to a sacred animal, a horse that carries souls between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Eli leaned forward eagerly. Like the big brown horse? Doc Williams' eyes sharpened. What do you know about that horse, young man? He's lonely, Eli said simply. He's been waiting for someone, but nobody in town will even look at him properly. The doctor exchanged a meaningful glance with Samuel. Has anyone told you the story of Mr. Blackwood and how he came to own that animal? Samuel started to object, but Doc Williams held up a hand. The boy should know the truth, Samuel. Ignorance breeds more fear than knowledge ever could. They settled into the comfortable chairs by the window, and Doc Williams began to speak in the measured tones of a man who understood the weight of stories. Cornelius Blackwood arrived in Cedar Bluff 4 years ago with plans to develop mining claims in the mountains. He was a wealthy man from back east, but there was something desperate about him, as if he was running from something he couldn't name. He brought that horse with him, and from the beginning, there was something different about the relationship between them. Different how? Samuel asked. The horse wouldn't let anyone else near it, for one thing. Blackwood himself seemed almost afraid of the animal, but he couldn't bring himself to sell it or give it away. He told Tom Bradley once that the horse had been given to him by a dying Lakota elder, along with warnings he wouldn't repeat. Eli's eyes were wide. What kind of warnings? That's where the story gets strange, son. Blackwood started having dreams vivid. Dreams of riding across endless plains with Native American warriors. He told me once that he felt like the horse was trying to take him somewhere he was afraid to go. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine, and then he disappeared. 3 years ago next month. The night of the big storm, the one that brought the flash floods and washed out the bridge. Blackwood went to bed in his hotel room and was simply gone by morning. His horse was still in the corral, but Blackwood himself vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. What do you think happened to him? Eli asked. Doc Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying the silver bridle in his hands. I think Cornelius Blackwood finally went where the horse wanted to take him. Whether that was death or something else, I couldn't say. They left the doctor's office with more questions than answers, but Samuel noticed that Eli had grown quiet and thoughtful. As they walked home, a stranger approached them on the main street, a weathered man in his 40s, with the easy gait of someone who spent his life around horses. Excuse me, the man said, tipping his hat. The name's Jake Morrison. I'm a horse trader passing through, and I heard you folks had some fine animals for sale. Samuel introduced himself and Eli, noting how Morrison's eyes lingered on the feed sack that contained the silver bridle. That's quite a horse they keep in the old corral, Morrison commented casually. Must be worth a fair amount to the right buyer. It's not for sale, Samuel replied curtly. Oh, I wasn't looking to buy. Just curious about the story behind it. That's a rare breed of horse, Lakota warhorse, unless I miss my guess. Don't see many of those anymore. Something in Morrison's tone made Samuel uneasy. You seem to know a lot about it. Morrison shrugged. I've been around horses all my life. Learned to recognize the special ones. His eyes moved to Eli, who was studying him with the intense gaze children reserve for adults they didn't quite trust. That's a fine boy you've got there. Got the look of someone who understands animals. We should be getting home, Samuel said, taking Eli's hand. Of course. Maybe I'll see you around town. I'm planning to stay for a few days. See what other horses might be available for purchase. As they walked away, Eli tugged on his father's sleeve. Pa, I don't like that man. Why not, son? His eyes are like the sheriff's eyes when he's pretending not to be angry. And he smells like fear. even though he's trying to act friendly. Samuel looked back at Morrison, who was still watching them from the middle of the street. There was something predatory in the man's posture, something that made Samuel want to get his son home and behind locked doors as quickly as possible. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Samuel sat on his porch cleaning his rifle and watching the shadows that moved between the buildings of Cedar Bluff. The silver bridle lay on the table beside him, its symbols seeming to writhe and shift in the lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of a horse's hooves on hard-packed earth, though he knew no one should be riding at this hour. Eli found the journal 3 days later, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the corner of the tack room where dust and cobwebs had kept it safe from discovery. The leather-bound book was thick with yellowed pages covered in careful handwriting, and even at 5 years old, Eli could tell it contained important secrets. He brought it to his father, who was shoeing their bay-mare in the morning heat. Samuel's face went pale when he saw the journal, recognizing the expensive leather binding and gold clasp that could only have belonged to one man. "Where did you find this, son?" "In the horse's place, under the floor. The boards were loose, and when I stepped on them, I heard something moving underneath." Samuel opened the journal carefully, afraid it might crumble in his hands. The first page bore an inscription in flowing script: "The private journal of Cornelius Blackwood, Anno Domini 1882. May God forgive me for what I have done, and what I must yet do." The entries began mundane enough notes about land purchases, mining surveys, meetings with local officials. But as Samuel read deeper, a different story emerged, one that made his blood run cold. July 15th, 1882. The horse grows more restless each night. I hear it calling to something in the darkness, a sound that no earthly animal should make. The Lakota elder's words echo in my mind. Some spirits choose their own masters. I begin to fear I was never the master at all. August 3rd, 1882. I had the dream again. Riding across endless plains beneath a sky full of stars that spelled out words in a language I do not know. The horse carries me towards something vast and terrible, something that waits beyond the edge of the world. I wake with the taste of dust and blood in my mouth. August 20th, 1882. Morrison arrived in town today. Fool that I was, I thought. I could trust him with the truth. Told him about the horse, about the dreams, about the elder's warnings. The greed in his eyes when I mentioned the medicine bundle hidden with the horse's gear tells me I have made a terrible mistake. Samuels. Hand shook as he read the name. Jake Morrison, the horse trader who'd approached them on the street, who'd asked too many questions about the giant brown horse. The same man Blackwood had trusted with deadly secrets. September 1st, 1882. Morrison grows more insistent about acquiring the horse. He speaks of its value to collectors, of Eastern buyers who pay fortunes for exotic animals. But I know better now. The horse is not a commodity to be sold. It is a sacred guardian, and I have been its unworthy keeper. The dreams show me what Morrison truly wants. The treasure the elder buried with the horse, the gold that was meant to ensure the spirit's safe passage to the next world. September 15th, 1882. I must hide this journal where Morrison cannot find it. Tonight I will bury the medicine bundle deeper, where only one chosen by the spirit can retrieve it. The horse knows. I see recognition in its ancient eyes, and I understand at last that my time as guardian is ending. Someone else will come, someone pure enough to complete the journey I was too weak to begin. The final entries were barely legible, written in a shaking hand that spoke of fear and desperation. September 28th, 1882. Morrison threatens to take the horse by force. I have sent word to the sheriff, but what law protects a man from his own greed? The horse stands motionless in the corral, as if waiting for Judgment Day. In my dreams, I ride toward a great light, and the spirits of the plains welcome me home. The journal ended there, but tucked between the final pages, Samuel found a crude map drawn in the same shaking hand. It showed the corral, the surrounding buildings, and a spot marked with an X beneath the words, "Where the guardian rests." "Pa, what does it say?" Eli asked, unable to read the grown-up writing, but sensing its importance. Samuel closed the journal, his mind racing. Blackwood hadn't simply disappeared. He'd been murdered by Morrison, who wanted the treasure buried with the horse. And now Morrison had returned to finish what he'd started 3 years ago. "It says that Mr. Blackwood knew he was in danger," Samuel told his son carefully, "and that the big horse has been waiting for someone special to help it finish an important job." "What kind of job?" Samuel looked at his son's earnest face and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "The horse is carrying the spirit of a Lakota warrior, Eli. It's been waiting for someone with the right heart to help that spirit find its way home to the place where all spirits rest." Eli's eyes widened with wonder rather than fear. "And the horse thinks I might be that person?" "It's possible, son. But it would be very dangerous. And the whole town would think we were crazy." That afternoon, Samuel made the decision to sell their remaining livestock to Pete Sanchez, keeping only the money they'd need to survive until he could find work elsewhere. The drought had made their situation desperate anyway, and Blackwood's journal had convinced him that staying in Cedar Bluff would only put Eli in greater danger. But as they prepared to leave town, word came that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson arrived at their door as the sun was setting, her face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Samuel, you need to know that horse trader Morrison has been asking questions about you and the boy." Tom Bradley heard him talking to some rough-looking men who rode in with him. "They're planning something, Samuel. Something that involves taking that horse, whether anyone likes it or not." Samuel felt his stomach drop. "When?" "Tonight, from what Tom overheard. They figure if they take the horse in the dark and get it out of town quick, nobody will stop them." Samuel looked at Eli, who was listening to every word with the intensity of a child who understood that his world was about to change forever. "Pa, we can't let them take the horse," Eli said quietly. "It's been waiting so long for someone to help it. We can't let bad men steal it before it finds what it's looking for." The weight of decision settled on Samuel's shoulders like a physical burden. He could pack up his son and run, leaving Cedar Bluff and its mysteries behind forever. Or he could stay and face whatever came, trusting in a 5-year-old boy's instinct that the giant brown horse was more than just an animal. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the mesa, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, Samuel heard the sound of horses' hooves approaching the town, and he knew that the time for running had passed. "Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly, "please ask Sheriff Martinez to come here as quickly as possible. And tell him to bring his gun." The Lakota medicine pouch was smaller than Eli's palm, made of soft doeskin and decorated with tiny beads in patterns that seemed to tell their own story. He'd found it wrapped in oilcloth alongside the silver bridle, hidden in a cavity behind loose stones in the tackroom wall. When his small fingers touched the leather, warmth spread up his arm like sunshine on a cold morning. Doc Williams examined the pouch with the reverence of a man who understood sacred things. "This is very old, Eli. Very powerful. See these beads? They're arranged in a pattern that represents the 4 directions, the sacred circle of life that connects all living things." Samuel watched his son hold the medicine pouch, noting how naturally the sacred object seemed to belong in the boy's hands. "Doc, I need to tell you something about our family that I've never told anyone." The older man looked up from his examination of the beadwork. "I'm listening." "My grandmother, my mother's mother, was Lakota. Her name was Running Deer, and she married my grandfather after he found her injured near his homestead during the Indian Wars. She died when I was young, but she used to tell me stories about spirit animals and sacred horses that carried warriors between worlds. Doc Williams nodded slowly. That would explain a great deal about Eli's connection to the horse. Native blood often carries spiritual sensitivities that skip generations. She left something for me when she died, Samuel continued, walking to an old trunk in the corner of the doctor's office. He withdrew a carved wooden eagle, its wings spread wide and its eyes inlaid with small pieces of turquoise. She said it would guide me when the time came to choose between the white world and the red world. Eli gasped when he saw the eagle. "Pa, it looks just like the bird in my dreams. The one that flies ahead of me when I'm riding the big horse across the sky." Samuel felt his chest tighten. He'd carried his grandmother's stories as folklore, interesting tales from a vanished world. But seeing the wonder in his son's eyes, the way Eli held the medicine pouch as if it were a living thing, Samuel began to understand that some stories were more than entertainment. They were heritage, responsibility, and destiny rolled into one. "There's more," Doc Williams said quietly. "I've been researching the symbols on that bridle, and I found something troubling. According to the tribal histories I've studied, that horse isn't just carrying any warrior spirit. It's carrying the spirit of a war chief named Burning Sky, who died defending his people from cavalry soldiers near the Black Hills." "What makes that troubling?" Samuel asked. "Burning Sky's spirit was bound to the horse by a medicine man who died before completing the ceremony. The spirit has been trapped between worlds for over 20 years, unable to find peace. It needs someone with the blood and the gift to complete the journey to the spirit world." Eli looked up from the medicine pouch, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. "That's why the horse has been waiting. It needs me to help the warrior find his way home." The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. His 5-year-old son was claiming a spiritual calling that would put him in opposition to everything the white world valued: safety, logic, the comfortable distance from mysteries that civilized people maintained. But before he could respond, Sheriff Martinez burst through the door, his face grim with urgency. "Samuel, we've got trouble. That horse trader Morrison brought 6 men with him, all armed and all looking like they've done this kind of work before. They're planning to take the horse tonight, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process." "Have you arrested Morrison?" Samuel asked. "On what charges?" "He hasn't done anything illegal yet, and Blackwood's journal would be considered hearsay in any court. All I can do is watch and wait for them to make the first move." Doc Williams stood and handed the medicine pouch back to Eli. "Perhaps it's time to consider that the law isn't equipped to handle this situation. Some problems require older solutions." Samuel looked at his son, who was clutching the medicine pouch and staring out the window toward the old corral. The giant brown horse stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its massive head turned toward them as if it could sense their conversation. "Pa," Eli said quietly, "the horse is scared. Morrison scares it because Morrison was there when Mr. Blackwood died. The horse remembers." "How do you know that, son?" "It tells me things when I listen with my heart instead of my ears. It shows me pictures of that night Mr. Blackwood trying to run, Morrison catching him, the horse watching from the corral while bad things happened." Sheriff Martinez exchanged a meaningful look with Doc Williams. "If the boy is right then, Morrison isn't just a horse thief. He's a murderer who's come back to finish covering his tracks. And he knows that Eli is the key to everything." Samuel realized with growing horror. "The horse responds to my son in ways it never responded to Blackwood. Morrison must have seen them together." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face white with fear. "Samuel, you need to come quick. Morrison and his men are at your house, going through your things, and they're asking questions about where you keep the boy at night." The terror that gripped Samuel's chest was primal and absolute. Morrison wasn't just after the horse, he was after Eli, the one person who could unlock the secrets that Blackwood had died protecting. Doc, can you keep Eli safe while I deal with this? Samuel, no, Doc Williams said firmly. If you go back there alone, you'll be walking into a trap. Morrison has waited 3 years to finish this business. He won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in his way. Eli tugged on his father's sleeve. Pa, we have to help the horse tonight. I can feel it. The warrior spirit is getting weaker. If we don't complete the ceremony soon, both the horse and the spirit will be lost forever. Samuel knelt beside his son, taking the boy's small hands in his own work-worn palms. Eli, what you're talking about is dangerous. More dangerous than anything a little boy should ever have to face. But I'm not just any little boy, am I, Pa? I'm Running Deer's great-grandson. I have her blood and her gift, and the warrior spirit has been waiting for me. The truth of it settled around them. Like dust after a windstorm, Samuel could deny his heritage, pack up his son, and run from the destiny that had been written in his blood. Or he could stand and face whatever came, trusting that his grandmother's stories contained wisdom deeper than fear. Outside, the last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars appeared like distant campfires in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, dangerous men were hunting for a frightened little boy and the secret he carried in his heart. The carved wooden eagle felt warm in Samuel's hands as he turned it over, examining the intricate featherwork that his grandmother Running Deer had treasured above all her possessions. The turquoise eyes seemed to watch him with ancient wisdom. And for the first time since childhood, Samuel could almost hear his grandmother's voice whispering across the years. She told me stories, Samuel said quietly, settling Eli on his lap while Doc Williams and Sheriff Martinez listened. Stories about how our people, the Lakota people, believed that some warriors were too strong to die completely. When they fell in battle defending what they loved, their spirits would bind themselves to sacred animals and wait for the right person to guide them home. Ethel traced the eagle's carved wings with one small finger, like the warrior in the big horse. Exactly. Like that, son. Your great-great-grandmother said that the gift to communicate with spirit animals was passed down through bloodlines, but it often skipped generations. She thought it might come to you when you grew older. But I'm only 5, Eli pointed out with the practical logic of childhood. Sometimes destiny doesn't wait for us to be ready, Doc Williams observed. Sometimes it arrives when it's needed most. Sheriff Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I'm trying to follow all this, but what I really need to know is how to keep Morrison and his men from killing anyone tonight. Spiritual heritage is fine, but bullets are more immediate. Samuel set the wooden eagle on the table, where it seemed to watch over their planning. What do we know about Morrison's intentions? He's got 6 armed men with him, all experienced in this kind of work from what I can tell. They've been asking questions about the horse, about Blackwood's disappearance, and specifically about any artifacts that might have been left behind. He knows about the treasure, Samuel realized. Blackwood's journal mentioned gold buried, with the horse's gear payment for the spirit's safe passage to the next world. How much gold are we talking about? Martinez asked Doc Williams consulted notes he'd made while researching Lakota burial customs. Enough to make a man very wealthy. When a war chief died, his people would sometimes bury significant treasure with his spiritual guardian to ensure safe passage between worlds. We could be talking about thousands of dollars worth of gold and precious stones. Eli looked up from the medicine pouch he'd been clutching. Pa, the horse is trying to tell me something important. It says the bad men are coming tonight, and they plan to hurt people to get what they want. Samuel felt his blood chill. What else does it tell you, son? It says Mr. Blackwood hid the treasure in a place where only someone with the true gift could find it. Morrison looked for 3 years, but never found it because he doesn't have the spiritual connection. That's why he needs me. The implication struck them all at once. Morrison hadn't returned just to steal the horse. He'd come back because he'd realized that Eli was the key to finding Blackwood's hidden treasure. "We need to get the boy out of town," Martinez said firmly. "Tonight." "No," Eli said with surprising firmness for a 5-year-old. "If we run away, the warrior spirit will never find peace, and Morrison will just keep hurting people until he gets what he wants. We have to finish this." Samuel looked at his son's determined face and saw his grandmother's fierce spirit looking back at him. Running Deer had never backed down from a fight when her people were threatened, and her blood ran strong in this small boy's veins. What would the ceremony involve? Samuel asked Doc Williams. According to the tribal histories, the spirit guardian would need to be ridden to a sacred place where the veil between worlds is thin. There, the person with the gift would perform a releasing ritual that allows the warrior spirit to cross over to the eternal hunting grounds. And where would this sacred place be? Somewhere high, where the earth meets the sky. In this territory, that would likely be the mesa overlooking Cedar Bluff, the same place where the Lakota used to hold their vision quests. Sheriff Martinez stood and checked his pistol. "Well, if we're gonna do this crazy thing, we better do it right. Morrison's men are watching the main roads, but there's an old trail that leads up the backside of the mesa. If we can get the boy and the horse up there, we—" Samuel interrupted. "You don't think I'm letting you face armed killers alone, do you? Besides, if this works, Morrison will be guilty of murder and attempted theft. That makes it my business." Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd made her own difficult decisions. "My grandfather was half Lakota too," she said softly. "I know these customs. If the boy is going to perform a sacred ceremony, he'll need help from someone who understands the old ways." Samuel felt emotion tighten his throat. After years of hiding his heritage, of pretending to be just another white settler trying to make a life in hard country, he was discovering that he wasn't alone. Others carried the same blood, the same connection to something larger than the everyday world of horses and homesteads. "There's something else," Eli said quietly. "The horse showed me where Mr. Blackwood hid the treasure. It's not buried in the ground. It's hidden in a place where Morrison would never think to look." "Where?" Samuel asked. "Inside the horse," Eli whispered. "Mr. Blackwood put it in special saddlebags that the horse carries. That's why the horse won't let anyone touch it. It's protecting the treasure and the warrior spirit both." The audacity of Blackwood's hiding place struck them all silent. Who would think to look for buried treasure on the back of the very animal everyone was afraid to approach? "That's why Morrison needs Eli," Doc Williams said slowly. "The boy is the only one the horse trusts enough to let him get close. Morrison's been waiting 3 years for someone like Eli to appear." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the main street. Through the window, they could see torches moving through the darkness and the silhouettes of armed men surrounding Doc Williams' building. "Looks like Morrison got tired of waiting," Sheriff Martinez said grimly, drawing his gun. But Eli was already moving toward the back door, the medicine pouch clutched in one hand and his great-great-grandmother's wooden eagle in the other. "Come on, Pa," he said with the calm certainty of a child who'd finally understood his purpose. "It's time to set the warrior spirit free." The hidden map tucked inside Blackwood's journal was more detailed than Samuel had first realized. By lamplight in Doc Williams' back room, with Morrison's men searching the streets outside, the careful pen strokes revealed a story more sinister than anyone had imagined. "Look at this," Doc Williams whispered, pointing to markings on the map that showed the old corral and the surrounding buildings. "These aren't just landmarks. They're a timeline. See these dates written in tiny script along the margins?" Samuel squinted at the faded ink. "September 29th, 1882. That's the day after Blackwood's last journal entry. And here, Doc Williams traced a thin line that led from the corral to a spot marked with an X behind the livery stable. This shows the path Blackwood took the night he died. He wasn't trying to escape town. He was trying to reach something he'd hidden. Ellie looked up from where he'd been quietly examining the medicine pouch. "Pa, the horse is showing me pictures." Again, Mr. Blackwood was carrying something heavy that night, something that made him walk slow and careful. Sheriff Martinez peered over their shoulders at the map. What was he carrying? Evidence, Samuel realized with growing horror. Blackwood wasn't just hiding treasure, he was documenting Morrison's crimes. This map shows where he buried proof of Morrison's real identity. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been watching the street through a crack in the curtains, turned back to them with urgent news. They're not just searching randomly out there. Morrison's men are moving in a pattern, checking every building systematically. They know we're here somewhere. But Doc Williams had made another discovery. "Samuel, look at this notation in the margin." Blackwood wrote J. Wanted in Kansas Territory for triple murder. He knew Morrison was a killer before he ever came to Cedar Bluff. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't come to Cedar Bluff as a legitimate horse trader. He'd come as a fugitive looking for a place to hide and a fortune to steal. Blackwood had discovered his true identity and paid for that knowledge with his life. "There's more," Doc Williams continued, his voice tight with excitement and fear. According to this, Morrison didn't work alone. He had partners who helped him track down wealthy men traveling with valuable animals. They've been operating across 3 territories for years. "And now he's back to finish what he started," Samuel said grimly. Eli tugged on his father's sleeve. "Pa, we need to go to the horse now. The warrior spirit is getting weaker. I can feel it fading. If we don't help it cross over tonight, it might be trapped forever." "Son, Morrison's men are out. They're waiting for us. The moment we show ourselves, that's why we need the proof," Sheriff Martinez interrupted. "If we can find where Blackwood buried the evidence of Morrison's crimes, we can expose him for what he really is." Mrs. Henderson had been studying the map while they talked. "I know this place," she said, pointing to the X mark. "My late husband used to keep his blacksmith tools in a shed behind the livery stable. There's a stone foundation there that's older than the town itself. How do we get there without Morrison seeing us?" Samuel asked. "The same way Blackwood did," Doc Williams replied, tracing the route with his finger. "Through the old mine shaft that runs beneath the main street. It was abandoned when the silver played out, but the tunnels are still passable." Eli looked up with eyes that seemed older than his 5 years. "The horse knows about the tunnel too. Mr. Blackwood used it to visit the horse secretly after Morrison arrived in town." The sound of splintering wood came from the front of the building. Morrison's men had grown tired of searching and were starting to break down doors. "Time to go," Martinez said, grabbing his rifle and extra ammunition. They slipped out the back door into the alley behind Doc Williams' office. The entrance to the old mine shaft was hidden beneath a rusted grate that took all 3 men working together to lift. The tunnel beyond disappeared into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light. "Are you sure about this, son?" Samuel asked Eli as they prepared to descend into the earth. "The warrior spirit is sure," Eli replied with calm certainty. "And great-great-grandmother Running Deer's eagle is warm in my hands. That means we're on the right path." The tunnel was narrow and musty, carved through solid rock by miners who dreamed of striking it rich in the unforgiving desert. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and more than once Samuel heard sounds that might have been pursuit or might have been his imagination. They emerged from the tunnel in the shed behind the livery stable, exactly where Blackwood's map had indicated. Mrs. Henderson was right. The stone foundation was old, far older than any other structure in Cedar Bluff. Symbols were carved into the weathered stones, symbols that looked remarkably similar to those on the silver bridle. "This was a sacred place," Eli whispered, kneeling beside the foundation. The Lakota used to come here for ceremonies long before the white people built the town. That's why Blackwood chose it, Doc Williams realized. He knew the spiritual significance would protect whatever he hid here. They found the cache buried beneath a loose stone that bore the carving of an eagle in flight. Inside a waterproof pouch were documents that made Samuel's blood run cold. Wanted posters for Jake Morrison and his associates, detailed accounts of their crimes across 3 territories, and a sworn statement by Blackwood describing Morrison's threats and demands. But the most damning evidence was a letter in Morrison's own handwriting, demanding that Blackwood turn over the Indian gold and all associated artifacts or face permanent consequences. This proves Morrison killed Blackwood for the treasure, Martinez said grimly. But we still need to get to the horse before. The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the night, followed by shouting from the direction of the old corral. Through the gaps in the shed walls, they could see torches moving toward the giant brown horse's enclosure. They're trying to take the horse by force, Mrs. Henderson gasped. Eli was already moving toward the door, the medicine pouch clutched in one hand and his great-great-grandmother's eagle in the other. We have to stop them, Pa. If Morrison touches the horse, the warrior spirit will be lost forever. Samuel caught his son's arm. Eli, those men have guns. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way. Then we don't get in their way, the boy said, with wisdom beyond his years. We go around them. The horse told me about another path, the old Lakota trail that leads up the mesa from the backside. That trail's been washed out for years, Martinez protested. Not for someone the horse trusts, Eli replied. Not for someone with the blood and the gift. The sound of Morrison's voice carried on the night wind, shouting orders to his men as they surrounded the corral. There was desperation in his tone. The sound of a man who'd waited 3 years for this moment and wouldn't be denied again. The horse is calling to me, Eli said suddenly, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. It says it's time to choose stay safe and let the warrior spirit die, or trust in the old ways and set both of them free. Samuel looked at his son's determined face and saw his grandmother running beer, looking back at him across the generations. She'd never counseled safety over honor, comfort over duty. Her spirit lived in this small boy, who was brave enough to face armed killers to honor a sacred trust. Then we finish what Blackwood started, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. We complete the ceremony and send the warrior spirit home. But even as they prepared to leave the shed, Samuel heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Morrison's men had found their trail, and the hunt was about to begin. In earnest, the sacred feather appeared at the moment Eli's small hand first touched the giant brown horse's neck. It materialized from nowhere, drifting down from the starlit sky to land softly on the boy's shoulder, a perfect eagle feather marked with the sacred colors of the 4 directions. Samuel watched in amazement as his son reached up to stroke the massive animal's muzzle, and the horse lowered its great head until their foreheads touched. The connection between them was visible now, shimmering in the air like heat waves rising from summer stone. For the first time in 3 years, the giant brown horse moved from the center of the corral, stepping forward to nuzzle Eli's hair with gentle affection. My God, Doc Williams whispered from their hiding place behind the water trough. The boy really can communicate with it. Sheriff Martinez kept his rifle trained on the shadows where Morrison's men were positioning themselves around the corral. That's all well and good, but we've still got 6 armed killers between us and safety. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter. How did the child get in there without us seeing him move? Samuel had been wondering the same thing. One moment, Ellie had been crouched beside him behind the trough, and the next he was standing in the corral as if he'd simply appeared there. The sacred feather and the medicine pouch seemed to glow with their own inner light as Eli spoke to the horse in words too soft for human ears to hear. Pa, Eli's voice carried clearly across the night air, though he spoke no louder than a whisper. "The horse says its name is Phantom, and the warrior spirit inside is ready to cross over. But we have to get to the sacred place on the mesa before dawn, or the pathway between worlds will close for another year." Morrison's harsh voice cut through the darkness from the other side of the corral. "There's the boy. Just like I figured, he's the key to everything. Take him alive, but kill anyone who tries to stop you." Samuel started to rise, but Eli held up one small hand. "No, Pa. This is the part where we trust the old ways. Great-great-grandmother. Running Deer's spirit is here with us now, and she's showing me what to do." The boy approached the horse with movements that seemed choreographed by ancient instinct. Phantom lowered itself to the ground in a gesture of submission and trust that took Samuel's breath away. No wild horse had ever offered such deference to a human, especially not a child. "Eli, be careful," Samuel called softly, but his son was already climbing onto the horse's broad back, settling himself with the natural grace of someone born to ride. The sacred feather remained on his shoulder as if held there by invisible hands, and the wooden eagle from his great-great-grandmother seemed to pulse with warm light in his small fist. Morrison burst into the corral with 3 of his men, there, guns drawn and their faces twisted with greed and desperation. "Get down from that horse, boy, and nobody has to get hurt." Eli looked down at the armed men with complete calm. "You're the one who hurt Mr. Blackwood. Phantom remembers everything that happened that night." "The horse don't remember nothing," Morrison snarled. "It's just an animal, and you're just a kid who don't know when to mind his own business. You killed Mr. Blackwood because he wouldn't tell you where the treasure was hidden," Eli continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "But you never found it because you don't understand that some treasures can only be claimed by those who deserve them." Morrison raised his pistol toward the boy. "Last chance, kid. Get down from that horse and tell me where Blackwood hid the gold, or I'll put a bullet in your—" Phantom rose to its feet with fluid grace, and suddenly Morrison was looking up at a sight that defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The horse seemed to grow larger, more magnificent, as if the warrior spirit within was manifesting itself for all to see. The eagle feather on Eli's shoulder caught fire with spiritual light, and the medicine pouch in his hand glowed like a small. "Son, you can't touch us," Eli said with quiet certainty. "The spirits of the ancestors protect those who honor the sacred ways." Samuel felt his own connection to his heritage awakening as he watched his son embrace powers that had been sleeping in their bloodline for generations. The wooden eagle in his own hands grew warm, and he could almost hear his grandmother Running Deer's voice whispering instructions across the years. "Sheriff," Samuel called to Martinez, "now would be a good time to arrest these men for the murder of Cornelius Blackwood." Martinez stepped into the corral with his rifle ready. "Jeg Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, theft, and conspiracy. Drop your weapons and surrender." But Morrison had passed beyond reason into the realm of desperate men with nothing left to lose. "Kill them all," he screamed to his remaining men. "The treasure is mine by right." The gunfight that erupted was brief but violent. Morrison's men had experience and ruthlessness on their side, but Samuel Martinez and Doc Williams had the advantage of fighting for something larger than personal gain. Mrs. Henderson proved surprisingly handy with the shotgun she'd concealed beneath her shawl, and her first blast sent 2 of Morrison's men diving for cover. Through it all, Eli sat calmly on Phantom's back while bullets whined through the air around them. The spiritual protection surrounding boy and horse seemed to turn aside any shot that came too close, as if an invisible shield deflected the violence of men who had no connection to the sacred. When the shooting stopped, Morrison stood alone. Among his fallen associates, his pistol empty and his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "It ain't possible," he muttered. Ain't no such thing as magic horses and spirit protection. There are more things in this world than your limited imagination can grasp. Doc Williams said quietly, reloading his rifle. Sheriff Martinez moved to arrest Morrison, but the horse. Trader pulled a hidden knife and lunged toward Eli with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Samuel cried out in warning, but there was no time to intervene. Phantom reared on its hind legs, striking out with iron-shod hooves that caught Morrison in the chest and sent him flying backward into the corral fence. The man hit the wooden rails with a sickening crack and slumped to the ground, his knife spinning away into the darkness. "Is he dead?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Doc Williams knelt beside Morrison's still form and checked for signs of life. "Unconscious, but alive. He'll live to stand trial for Blackwood's murder." Eli slipped down from Phantom's back and approached his father with eyes that held new depths of understanding. "Pa, the warrior spirit says thank you for letting me help, but the ceremony isn't finished yet. We still have to ride to the sacred place so Burning Sky can cross over to the eternal hunting grounds." Samuel knelt and embraced his son, feeling the warmth of the sacred feather and the power that still flowed between the boy and the magnificent horse. "Are you sure you're ready for this, son? Son? The ceremony will change both of us. There's no going back to the way things were." "I know, Pa, but great-great-grandmother Running Deer says that change isn't something to fear. It's something to embrace when it comes from love and honor." Sheriff Martinez secured Morrison with rope and posted Doc Williams to guard the other. "Prisoners, I'll follow you up the Mesa Trail with Mrs. Henderson. This needs to be witnessed by representatives of both worlds, the white world and the red world." As they prepared to leave the corral, Samuel noticed that other townspeople had emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the strange light that had surrounded the ceremony. They watched in amazed silence as Eli climbed back onto Phantom's broad back and the horse turned toward the ancient trail that led up the mesa. "Pa, climb up behind me," Eli said. "Phantom says this journey requires both father and son, both the one who carries the gift and the one who chose, to honor it." Samuel swung up behind his son, feeling the horse's incredible power beneath them and the warmth of spiritual connection flowing through the sacred feather that now rested on his own shoulder. As Phantom began the steep climb toward the mesa's summit, Samuel understood that they were no longer simply riding a horse. They were being carried by legend itself toward a destiny written in the stars. Behind them, the lights of Cedar Bluff grew smaller, and ahead, the sacred place where earth met sky waited for the completion of a ceremony that had been 20 years in the making. The blood-stained bandana lay half-buried beneath a cairn of stones at the sacred site, exactly where the spirits had shown Eli it would be. As Phantom approached the ancient circle of standing stones that crowned the mesa, the boy pointed to a gap between two weathered monoliths where something red fluttered in the dawn breeze. "There, Pa. That's what we came to find." Samuel dismounted and carefully lifted the stones that had concealed Cornelius Blackwood's final message to the world. The bandana was stiff with dried blood and bore Blackwood's initials embroidered in one corner, but more importantly, it was wrapped around a small metal cylinder that contained his last testament. "My name is Cornelius Blackwood," Samuel read aloud from the water-stained paper. "If this message is found, know that I was murdered by Jake Morrison and his associates on September 29th, 1882. I die protecting a sacred trust given to me by the Lakota elder Many Horses to guard the spirit of the war chief Burning Sky until someone with the true gift could complete the crossing ceremony." Sheriff Martinez and Mrs. Henderson arrived at the sacred circle just as Samuel finished reading. The sheriff examined the bandana and the testament with the careful attention of a lawman gathering evidence. "This proves Morrison's guilt beyond any doubt," Martinez said grimly. "Along with the other evidence we found, this will see him hanged for murder. But Eli had already moved to the center of the stone circle, where Phantom stood with head raised toward the lightening eastern sky. The sacred feather on the boy's shoulder began to glow with soft light as the first rays of dawn touched the ancient stones. "The warrior spirit is ready," Eli announced, his young voice carrying the authority of generations of spiritual tradition. "Burning Sky has been waiting 20 years to join his people in the eternal hunting grounds." Mrs. Henderson gasped as a translucent figure began to materialize above Phantom's back, the ghostly form of a Lakota warrior in full battle regalia, his long hair streaming in a wind that touched nothing else on the mesa. The spirit's eyes were kind but ancient, filled with the patience of one who had waited beyond death for justice and release. "He's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The warrior spirit of Burning Sky turned his ancient gaze toward Eli, and the boy felt a profound connection that transcended the boundaries between worlds. Through the sacred feather and the medicine pouch, he could hear the warrior's voice speaking in words that bypassed his ears and went straight to his heart. "Little brother," Burning Sky's spirit voice resonated with the wisdom of ages. "You have shown great courage to help me find my way home. The blood of our people runs strong in your veins, and the gift of your great-great-grandmother running deer flows through you like a river of light." Eli bowed his head respectfully. "I'm honored to help you, Burning Sky, but I don't know how to complete the ceremony." "The knowledge is already within you," the warrior spirit replied. "Trust in the old ways and let your heart guide you." Samuel watched in amazement as his 5-year-old son began to move with the fluid grace of someone far older and more experienced. Eli raised the medicine pouch toward the 4 directions, speaking words in Lakota that he couldn't possibly have learned but somehow knew by heart. The air around the stone circle began to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Phantom's coat gleamed like polished bronze in the growing light, and the horse's eyes reflected depths that seemed to contain the memory of countless plains and endless skies. "Something's happening," Sheriff Martinez said, his voice hushed with awe. A pathway of light began to form in the eastern sky, stretching from the sacred circle toward the rising sun. The light was not harsh, but gentle, welcoming, like the glow of campfires across a vast prairie. Along the pathway, other figures became visible, the spirits of Lakota warriors who had crossed over before, waiting to welcome their war chief home. Burning Sky's spirit form grew more solid and defined as the ceremony progressed. He was a magnificent figure, tall and proud, with eagle feathers in his hair and war paint that told the story of his battles in defense of his people. His eyes held no anger, only the deep satisfaction of a duty finally completed. "Thank you, little brother," Burning Sky said to Eli. "Because of your courage, I can finally join my ancestors in the place where all spirits find peace." The warrior spirit began to rise from Phantom's back, moving slowly toward the pathway of light that stretched across the dawn sky. As he ascended, the ghostly forms of his fellow warriors reached out to welcome him, and the sound of distant drums echoed across the mesa. But even as the spiritual ceremony reached its climax, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the trail below. Morrison had somehow escaped custody and was making one final desperate attempt to claim the treasure he'd killed for. "They're coming," Mrs. Henderson warned, pointing toward dust clouds rising from the switchback trail. Samuel felt his chest tighten with fear. Morrison and whatever men he'd gathered would arrive just as the ceremony reached its most vulnerable moment. If they disrupted the crossing ritual, Burning Sky spirit might be lost forever, trapped between worlds with no hope of peace. "Can we complete the ceremony in time?" Samuel asked desperately. Eli looked up at his father with eyes that held calm certainty. "Burning Sky says not to worry, Pa. The spirits have their own ways of protecting what's sacred." As if summoned by the boy's words, the ghostly warriors along the pathway of light began to descend toward the mesa. their translucent forms growing more solid with each passing moment. They arranged themselves in a protective circle around the sacred stones, their ancient weapons ready to defend the ceremony from any earthly interference. Morrison's shouts echoed from the trail as he drove his horse hard up the steep path. But the spirit warriors stood ready to ensure that no force of greed or violence would prevent their war chief from finding the peace he'd waited 20 years to claim. The golden compass in Eli's hand spun wildly before settling on a direction that pointed not toward magnetic north, but towards something far more valuable. Hidden beneath Phantom's magnificent saddle, secured in leather bags that had been crafted by Lakota artisans generations ago, lay the treasure that Morrison had killed for enough gold and precious stones to buy a small kingdom. But as Morrison and his remaining men crested the mesa's edge, their horses lathered and wild-eyed from the punishing climb, it became clear that mere wealth was no longer what drove the desperate outlaw. His face was twisted with rage and something approaching madness, his clothes torn from forcing his way through Sheriff Martinez's inadequate restraints. "There!" Morrison screamed, pointing toward Eli and Phantom. "The boys found it. The treasures. Right there!" But the spirit warriors who had descended from the pathway of light stood between Morrison and his goal, their ghostly forms shimmering like heat mirages in the dawn air. The outlaw's horse reared in terror as it encountered the spiritual guardians, throwing Morrison from the saddle and sending him sprawling across the ancient stones. Samuel stepped protectively in front of his son, though he knew that earthly weapons were useless against the otherworldly forces now at play on the sacred mesa. "It's over, Morrison," Sheriff Martinez called out, having followed the outlaw up the treacherous trail. "Drop your weapons and surrender." Morrison struggled to his feet, his pistol wavering between Samuel and Eli. 20 years I've searched for this treasure. 20 years of following leads and hunting down every story about Lakota gold. I ain't leaving empty-handed." "The treasure was never meant for you," Eli said quietly, his small voice carrying clearly across the stone circle. "It belongs to Burning Sky's spirit, payment for his journey to the eternal hunting grounds." The golden compass in the boy's hands began to glow with the same ethereal light as the sacred feather, and suddenly Morrison could see what others had been blind to, the spiritual riches that far exceeded any earthly wealth. The ghost of Burning Sky stood tall and proud beside Phantom, his war regalia shining with light that came from beyond the physical world. "Impossible," Morrison whispered, his gun hand trembling. "Ghosts ain't real. Spirits ain't real. There's only gold and the men strong enough to take it." But even as he spoke, the evidence of his eyes contradicted his words. The pathway of light in the eastern sky pulsed with welcoming radiance, and the spirit warriors who guarded the sacred circle stood ready to defend their war chief's final journey. "You killed Cornelius Blackwood for nothing," Doc Williams called out, having arrived with Mrs. Henderson and several townspeople who'd followed the trail of violence up the mesa. "The treasure was never his to give. It was held in trust for the warrior spirit's crossing ceremony." Morrison's remaining men, faced with supernatural forces they couldn't understand or fight, threw down their weapons and surrendered to Sheriff Martinez. But Morrison himself seemed to have passed beyond reason into a realm where greed had consumed everything human about him. "I don't care about spirits or ceremonies," he raged. "I want what's mine." He raised his pistol toward Eli, but before he could fire, Phantom reared up with magnificent fury. The great horse's hooves struck Morrison in the chest, sending him flying backward toward the edge of the mesa. The outlaw's scream echoed across the desert as he fell, his voice fading into the dawn wind. Sheriff Martinez approached the edge carefully and peered down the rocky slope. "He's alive, but he won't be going anywhere soon. Looks like he landed on a ledge about 30 feet down." But Eli had already turned his attention back to the sacred ceremony. Burning Sky's spirit was beginning to fade as the pathway of light beckoned him toward his eternal rest. The warrior's ghostly form raised one hand in salute to the boy who had made his crossing possible. "Remember this day, little brother." Burning Sky's voice resonated in Eli's heart. "Remember that courage and honor are worth more than all the gold in the earth. Your people will need that wisdom in the times to come." The golden compass in Eli's hands dissolved into sparkling dust that was caught by the morning breeze and scattered across the sacred stones. The treasure bags on Phantom's back shimmered and vanished, their earthly purpose fulfilled now that the spiritual journey was complete. As Biz. Burning Sky's spirit ascended the pathway of light toward his waiting ancestors. The ghostly warriors who had guarded the ceremony began to fade as well. One by one, they raised their weapons in salute to Eli and Samuel before dissolving into the golden radiance of the dawn. The last to disappear was the spirit of Running Deer, Eli's great-great-grandmother, who appeared briefly beside her descendant with eyes full of pride and love. "You have honored our people well, little one," she whispered. "The blood remembers, and the gift lives on." When the light faded and the pathway closed, only silence remained on the sacred mesa. Phantom stood quietly, no longer carrying the burden of a trapped spirit, but transformed into an ordinary though magnificent horse who had served his sacred purpose. The new bridle that Samuel crafted for Phantom was simple and functional, made from honest leather and brass fittings that spoke of practical use rather than ceremonial grandeur. 6 months after the events on the sacred mesa, it represented everything the Thorne family had learned about honoring tradition while embracing the future. Cedar Bluff had changed in the months following Morrison's arrest and trial. The drought had finally broken 3 days after Burning Sky's spirit crossed over, bringing gentle rains that transformed a brittle landscape into something green and hopeful. The townspeople spoke of it as coincidence, but Samuel and Eli knew better. The land itself had been waiting for spiritual balance to be restored. Sheriff Martinez had testified at Morrison's trial, presenting the blood-stained bandana and Blackwood's final testament as evidence that ensured the murderer would spend the rest of his life in territorial prison. The other members of Morrison's gang had been sentenced to various terms, and the circuit judge had declared the case one of the most clear-cut examples of frontier justice he'd ever seen. Phantom wants to visit the old corral today," Eli announced over breakfast, his dark eyes bright with the contentment that had replaced his earlier loneliness. "He says it's important to remember where stories begin, even when they have happy endings." Samuel smiled at his son, marveling at how much the boy had grown in confidence and wisdom since accepting his spiritual heritage. At 5.5, Eli moved through the world with a quiet authority that came from understanding his place in something larger than himself. "Then we'll take him there after we finish the morning chores," Samuel agreed, reaching across the table to ruffle his son's hair. Their small adobe house had been expanded with a new room where Samuel's bride-to-be, Elena Martinez, the sheriff's widowed daughter who'd returned to Cedar Bluff to help care for her aging father, would keep her weaving loom and the children's books she'd brought from Santa Fe. Elena understood about heritage and the importance of honoring the past while building for the future. Doc Williams had become the unofficial keeper of their story, documenting the events for the Territorial Historical Society and corresponding with scholars who studied Native American spiritual practices. His account had attracted visitors from as far away as Washington, D.C., though Samuel made sure that Eli's privacy was protected from those who saw the boy as a curiosity rather than a child. Mrs. Henderson's general store now featured a section devoted to authentic Lakota craftwork made by artisans from the reservation who'd heard about the spiritual ceremony and wanted to honor the memory of Burning Sky. The elderly shopkeeper had discovered a pride in her own native heritage that she'd hidden for decades, and her store had become a gathering place for others who carried similar mixed bloodlines. "Pa, look," Eli said as they led Phantom to the old corral. "Someone's been taking care of the place." The ramshackle fence had been repaired with new posts and rails, and the tack room had been cleaned and restocked with fresh hay. A simple wooden sign by the gate read, "Sacred ground treat with respect." Sheriff Martinez emerged from the tack room, carrying a bucket of water for the new wooden trough. "Figured this place deserved better than to fall apart," he explained. "Some of the younger folks have been asking questions about the old ways, wanting to learn about their own heritage." Eli led Phantom into the corral, where the magnificent horse had stood in spiritual captivity for 3 years. But now the enclosure served a different purpose. It had become a place where children from mixed families could come to learn about their ancestors and the traditions that connected them to something larger than the everyday world. "The horse remembers everything," Eli said softly, running his small hands along Phantom's neck. "But he's not sad anymore. He's proud of what we accomplished together." Samuel watched his son work with the great horse, teaching it new commands and building. The kind of partnership that honored both the animal's intelligence and its willing cooperation. There was no fear in their relationship, no dominance or submission, only mutual respect and affection. Elena arrived as the afternoon sun began to slant toward the western mountains, carrying a picnic basket and wearing the bright blue dress that reminded Samuel so powerfully of his late wife Maria. But the pain of that memory had transformed into something gentler. Gratitude for love that had been, and anticipation for love that was growing. "The Padre says he can perform the wedding ceremony next month," Elena announced, settling beside Samuel on the corral fence. "Unless you'd prefer to wait until Eli's birthday in the spring. I think great-great-grandmother Running Deer's spirit wants us to be a family sooner rather than later," Eli said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that had become his trademark. "She says happiness shouldn't wait when it's ready to bloom." They shared their picnic in the shade of the cottonwood tree that grew beside the old corral, watching Phantom graze contentedly while children from town played games that mixed cowboy adventures with Lakota traditions. The sound of their laughter carried across the desert, evidence that fear and ignorance were giving way to understanding and acceptance. As the sun set behind the mesa where the sacred ceremony had taken place, Eli climbed onto Phantom's back for their evening ride. Father and son and horse moved across the landscape like figures from a legend, connected by bonds that transcended the ordinary world. The giant brown horse that had once been forbidden to touch now carried a little boy toward dreams that honored both his heritage and his future. And in the growing darkness, the spirits of the ancestors smiled down on Cedar Bluff, knowing that the old ways lived on in the hearts of those brave enough to remember them. The story that had begun with loneliness and fear had transformed into one of connection and hope, proof that some rules are meant to be broken when breaking them leads to healing. And sometimes, the bravest thing a child can do is reach out to touch the very thing that frightens everyone else.